Today we're going to talk about human impact on climate, and the goal of this video is to explain how humans are causing global warming through the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. To understand human impact on the climate, you have to understand how carbon is stored and released. So that's what we're going to look at on this slide. There are places in the ecosystem that store carbon, and these are called carbon reservoirs. Now, a carbon reservoir is sometimes you'll see this term used. It's a carbon sink. Now, a carbon sink is a reservoir, like a holding place, that stores carbon, and specifically, it stores more carbon than it releases. So, in this picture, you can see there's atmospheric CO2. The plants take in the CO2, so the plants would be an example of a carbon sink. They are a reservoir for carbon. Now, a carbon source is a process that releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So look at the plants again, or the animals, either one. Both of them perform cellular respiration. Both of them release carbon back into the atmosphere. So in this case, plants would be both a carbon sink and a carbon source. So I'll give you some other examples here. Examples of a carbon sink would be forests or oceans. You'll notice this water, this body of water here, it's taking in carbon dioxide and it's also releasing carbon dioxide. And an example of a carbon source would be, again, these are processes that release carbon to the atmosphere. Examples of that would be burning fossil fuels, which is what you see happening with this factory. The factory is removing fossil fuels from the ground, like this oil and gas and coal. They're burning those, and that puts carbon into the atmosphere. Also, deforestation. So if you look over here, there are trees being, in this case, they're being burned, but you could be cutting them down. Those would be examples of carbon sources as well. They're putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So that's the difference between a carbon sink, which stores carbon, and a carbon source, which releases carbon. And the amount of time that carbon stays in a reservoir, like a carbon sink, is called the residence time. Okay, so that gives you the sense of how carbon gets stored and released. With that in mind, now you can begin to better appreciate how humans impact that process, where carbon is being cycled through carbon sinks and carbon sources. All right. The human use of fossil fuels to supply energy has actually disrupted the natural balance between carbon sinks and carbon sources in the carbon cycle. So our activity is disrupting the natural balance between those two things, the carbon sinks and carbon sources. Fossil fuels are a sink for CO2 when they form. They store carbon, but they become a source for CO2 when they get burned. And the use of these fossil fuels is actually increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. You can see in this top image, this is a picture of a factory that is burning fossil fuels and putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And this graph shows you how carbon dioxide has been, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been increasing for decades. All right, now, besides the burning of fossil fuels, humans are also responsible for deforestation. And deforestation is the process of cutting down or burning trees in a forested area. Keep in mind, like I mentioned a minute ago, trees are naturally a sink for CO2. They store carbon. They take the carbon out of the atmosphere during photosynthesis. But when trees are cut down, they actually lose their ability to absorb carbon dioxide. They're not going to perform photosynthesis anymore, so they're not going to absorb that CO2. In addition to that, trees that are burned or decompose, they actually become a source for CO2. So if you allow a tree to rot, it's giving off CO2. If you burn the tree, it gives off CO2, and this puts CO2 back in the atmosphere. And again, that can actually increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So these are two human activities, burning of fossil fuels and deforestation, that are increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Why is that important? Why is CO2 in the atmosphere? Why does that even matter? Well, CO2 is a greenhouse gas, And greenhouse gases trap heat from the sun that would normally radiate back out into space. So look at this left image. You have the sun. Here's solar radiation that hits Earth. And under normal circumstances, some of that energy is trapped. Some of that solar energy is trapped, but some of it's released back out into space. What happens when there's an excessive amount of CO2 in the atmosphere? The solar energy enters our atmosphere, but very, very little of it actually escapes back out into space. Almost all that heat gets trapped within our atmosphere. What's the consequence of that? Well, the excessive CO2 results in more heat being trapped, which causes global warming. Global warming is the worldwide increase in Earth's average surface temperature. So Earth, on average, is getting hotter. That's why CO2 in our atmosphere matters. If we're pumping excessive amounts, it causes global warming. How does global warming affect our Earth? It does it in a number of ways. Let's look at sea levels first. As Earth gets warmer, glaciers melt, and this causes sea levels to rise. Now, what's so bad about that? Rising sea levels are a serious threat because of flooding. They can flood this can result in the flooding of large cities like New York or LA or San Francisco. These are all places in the United States. And airports, railroads, highways, factories, they would also get damaged. Now think about that. If lots of airports and railroads and highways and factories were getting damaged, imagine the kind of chaos that you would get. Those things would get damaged from flooding, and this flooding can happen because of rising sea levels due to glaciers melting, due to global warming. Hopefully you're getting a sense of the kind of causal chain here, how one thing can cause another thing, to happen. And this can lead to negative effects. Now, one last point about sea levels here. Our climate models are predicting that there will be half as much ice, sea ice, I should say, in 2050 as there was in 1950. On the left, you see an image, this green patch here. This shows the thickness of the ice. When it's very green or almost white, it's very thick. But you'll notice here it's mostly green, and some has even turned to blue. Blue's hardly thick at all. So we're losing a lot of our ice. It's melting. Okay, in addition to sea levels rising, we also, human activity through burning fossil fuels and deforestation is causing ocean acidification. Oceans are a carbon sink. They absorb carbon. And when there's excessive CO2 in the atmosphere, they absorb an excessive amount of CO2. But that CO2 is going to react with the water, and it forms what's called carbonic acid. So if our if our oceans specifically get a lot of acid in them, that's going to decrease their pH. It's going to make them more acidic. What's so bad about that? Well, the lower pH causes thinner and deformed shells in some marine organisms. That's what you're seeing in this top image here. These are normal shells, but due to ocean acidification, these are the deformed shells. Also, the lower pH can result in the loss of coral reefs. On the left, you have a healthy coral reef. On the right, you have an unhealthy. It's basically a dead coral reef at this point. And this is what can happen because of ocean acidification. These effects are bad because they're bad for a number of reasons, but at least this much. They impact commercial fisheries and aquaculture industries. So think of all the industries that deal in fishing industries. If they provide seafood to restaurants, say, this is going to impact them. Now, if coral reefs die, that's going to affect a lot more. But again, this is at least one negative impact that you can see. Okay, so I've talked about how humans are impacting both the ocean acidification and sea levels. To finish up, let's talk about how humans are impacting agriculture. When we burn fossil fuels and cut down a lot of trees, and so on. It puts CO2 in the atmosphere. What's that going to do? This is going to cause changes in temperature and precipitation. And that can lead to shifts in growing seasons. And that's going to affect the timing of planting and harvesting. So when farmers are trying to plant at certain times of the year, if the growing season changes, that's going to have an effect on them. What would be so bad if the growing season changed? Well, if it's now the case that global temperatures are rising and there's extreme cases of extreme heat, like say during summers, well, that's going to stress the crops and reduce the yields that we get. So we're not going to be able to produce as much. Also, if the weather's changing, extreme weather like floods and droughts, this can result in soil erosion. And that's going to take nutrients out of the soil. That's going to decrease the fertility of the land. The land's not going to be able to produce, which again reduces yields. Also, new pests can more easily spread in these sorts of conditions, and that's going to reduce crop yields. So all of that, because you have lower crop yields, that's going to affect the availability of forage and feed for livestock. And again, that's going to negatively impact the meat and dairy industry. We're going to have less of these things. So I've identified humans impacting sea levels, humans impacting ocean acidification, and humans impacting agriculture, all through the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation.